This video tutorial is your introduction to the basic techniques of veneering. It's one of the most useful techniques for the furniture maker, an essential skill that undoubtedly you'll use in your career. Just to clear up some misconceptions, some people think that veneered wood is fake. It's a cheap alternative to solid wood, and whereas sometimes that does happen, and you'll see if you go around furniture shops, you'll see all sorts of veneered wood, cheap, from very cheap to very expensive. Really, we need to get away from this idea that it's a cheap alternative. It's a highly skilled technique that the best cabinet makers have used for centuries to produce really, really good quality timber. If you work as a cabinet maker in the modern industry, creating furniture for rich and discerning clients, you will be using veneers. So it's a very, very important technique. And as you can see from these pictures, it's something that's used in a broad range of furniture, from traditional to the very modern. So why do we veneer? If we look at this piece of burr walnut veneer, it's very attractive, and it's something that's been used an awful lot in furniture making. It was very, very popular for quite a while in the 17th, 16th, 17th centuries, coming back into fashion a little bit now. And really, if this was solid wood, it would be unusable. You can see the grain, and by now in the course you should be getting pretty familiar with the idea of how grain affects the workability and the strength of wood. You can imagine this very wild flowing grain would create a very weak piece of timber, very difficult to work. So one good use of veneer is to take timber that looks attractive but would otherwise be very difficult to use, and to make it usable, to make it into usable furniture. So we need a strong substrate which we overlay with an attractive veneer. One of the main uses. Another good use for veneer is to keep our consciences clear as woodworkers and to stretch the resources that we've got. Obviously, this piece of veneer is a very small part of the tree that it came from. You can make a lot of furniture using cheap, environmentally friendly substrates and maybe very, very rare veneers. So it's good for the environment, it's good for the resources of trees that we've got, and therefore good for our conscience. So two good reasons to use veneers. One final one is that you can use something that's very stable for your substrate. You can make very large, flat surfaces using all sorts of timber, which if we made from solid wood, might tend to bow and cup or deform. So very reliable, solid furniture. So that's why we do it. Now we're going to have a look at our aims and objectives for this session, and we're going to have a look at some of the very basic techniques just to get you started. There are lots of techniques that you can research for veneering, from very traditional hammer veneering using animal glues right through to some very modern techniques using presses and very complex gadgetry. What we're going to look at today is a couple of techniques that are really easy to do. You could say the kitchen tabletop techniques. We're using some pretty simple tools. Some of these tools you could even get away without, so you could pretty much, with your veneers, with some MDF or plywood for a substrate, and a craft knife and some glue, you could pretty much do some of these yourself. So very cheap and easy way to get started. This is a foundation to build from, so you can investigate other techniques. These are some good fundamentals. The first technique that we're going to use is called Caul and clamp veneering. We use ordinary PVA glue, and as I go through the demo, you're going to see that we need some clamps and some flat pieces of wood and some cauls, and I'll explain what they are as we go through the demo. So this is our test piece. This is what we're going to be working with. We've got some MDF. This could be plywood, it could even be solid wood, but you want something that's not going to move too much, something nice and stable for your base material, your substrate. And we're using a little bit of Iroko for our veneer. It's a fairly straight-grained, relatively straight-grained, fairly flat veneer, so we don't have to worry about flattening it out. We're going to look at techniques for that in a minute. So we can pretty much go straight into gluing these together. So we're going to get an even coating of our PVA glue. I'm just going to take the top off of that and just get a small amount of glue on our MDF substrate, and then I'm going to use a spreader to spread it out evenly. This spreader is just an ordinary plastic spreader that came with our impact adhesive. You can buy them separately. You can buy metal ones which are a little bit better, they'll last a little bit longer. I'm just using the one that came with the impact adhesive because we're going to be using this in a bit. One thing that you do have to do when you first buy it, you see that it's got a serrated edge, and those serrations are too big. They're too large for good quality cabinet making work. So what you need to do is get some sandpaper on a block and just file those down till they're about a millimetre and a half deep from the 2 or 3 mil that they start off at. So that's quite important, otherwise we'll have too much glue and our gluing up won't work. Okay, so having done that, I'm just going to spread this glue nice and evenly all over the substrate. Try and make it as even as possible. And right up to the edges. Obviously we need total contact. Pop that to one side. And then the next thing I'm going to do is apply my veneer. So I turn that upside down and I'm thinking about the grain of this veneer and how I want the finished product to look. So I'm not putting it on at any sort of funny angles. I'm following the grain. I've got an idea where it's going and I'm going to put that in place there. And just to save any damage when I'm gluing up, I'm just going to trim very roughly my veneer. That's really rough, that's rather following the grain. I could use a straight edge for this, but it doesn't really matter. Just trimming my veneer so I don't have a lot of overhanging edges. Next I'm getting 2 solid flat boards. This is birch plywood, nice and solid. You could do this with MDF, anything that's going to stay nice and straight under clamping pressure. And I put my my workpiece in the middle of those clamps. Right, this is where it gets a little bit fiddly. And I'm going to use the Cauls. These look like fairly ordinary bits of wood. They're called Cauls, clamping Cauls, and something that I've done to them to even out the clamping pressure right over these platens, these solid pieces of wood that we're clamping between, is I've put a very, very slight camber on these Cauls. If I put 2 of those together, you can see that there's a gap here and here. So very, very slight, only a matter of a millimetre or so on each. The top is still flat, so I mark the top, so I know which way to put them. What that does is when I clamp here and here, it means that it flattens those Cauls and continues to put pressure in the middle, which a perfectly flat piece of wood wouldn't. That would concentrate the clamping pressure here and here, not right across the platens, which is what I need. Okay, so make sure I've got the tops and the bottoms all lined up. And if you're doing a lot of this, you could probably jig something up that's a little bit more user-friendly than what we've got here. You can make stands to clamp on so you can get the clamps around things a little bit better. What I usually do is, I'm usually working in a workshop with other people, so I get someone to help me. So the next stage is I'm going to get a friend to help me and start clamping this up, and we'll see how the whole thing goes together. Right, so with a bit of help, I've got all these clamps in place. Just putting the last one in place, and I'm just nipping them up. I'm over tightening anything now, and then tighten in sequence. If any of you are mechanics and you've ever put a cylinder head on a car, you'll know that anything like this, you want to tighten it in sequence. So you do your diagonals, and then in the middle, just a little bit at a time, just a quarter of a turn or so at a time. And you can check your workpiece, make sure that there's glue spreading out from all those glue lines. Don't worry about cleaning the glue off at this stage, just leave that. Try and keep your sequence going. Sometimes you forget where you are. As long as you're pretty much evenly clamping everything up, then you're not going to be in danger of making your workpiece slip out of place. That glue's quite slippy until it starts to set, and we can get an uneven clamp, or we can get the workpiece moving and slipping in relation to each other if we don't tighten it up evenly. So that's all done. I'm going to leave that in its clamps for maybe an hour. 5-minute glue, leave it for about an hour, and that should be ready to come off. If you're not too busy, leave it for 24 hours, and then you know that glue's completely gone off before you start doing the next operation. So there are limitations to the technique that we've just shown you. One of those limitations is that obviously the workpiece that you're working on is going to need to be in the clamps for at least an hour or so. So that could limit your day. In industry, they get over that problem with heated rollers or heated presses to speed up that process. You're not going to have heated machinery on your kitchen table. And there is another method that's much quicker, and that's using impact adhesive, Evo stick. Some cabinet makers are a little bit sniffy about it. They think that it's a bit of a cheat. I've heard people say that the veneer won't last as long with this as it would with some of the other traditional methods. However, in my industry experience, this is the method of choice. I've worked in all sorts of environments where using contact adhesive or impact adhesive is exactly what's used, and it's used for very, very high specification, high quality work on aircraft, on boat fitting out, on hotel furniture, on private work for individuals who are paying for a quality product. So I think really the idea that this is somehow a low grade technique is probably a little bit of snobbery. So we're going to have a look at it because I think it's a really easy and useful technique, especially for those of you just getting started. So in this case, we've got a substrate which is MDF, and we've got a veneer which is just a mahogany type species. It's just a fairly cheap and nasty bit of veneer really that I'm just using for this demonstration process. Obviously there's some much prettier veneers out there, and when you're practicing, when you're trying things out, it's probably worth popping around to a craft supplier and seeing if you can get some really nice veneer to work with. However, this is what we're going to demonstrate with. We find out how everything's going to fit, and in this case I've trimmed my veneer before I start to glue, and we work out which is our face side on both the substrate and the veneer. So if you look very, very carefully at the veneer, you sometimes need to catch it in the light. You'll see score marks, you'll see knife marks where the veneer's been sliced, and those knife marks ideally want to be on the glue side. You have a slightly better face that we're going to put on the outside. There's a couple of reasons for that. Not only does it make cleaning up more easy when you come to finish your veneered work, it also, the veneer, as it's been cut with a knife off of a roller, it's put under pressure. There's tension put on the grain, and it's better for that stressed grain to be on the side that's glued down than on the side that we're going to see. So I've looked very, very carefully. I can see slight indications of knife marks on this side, so I'm putting that as my glue side. I've put a face mark on that, probably just for the sake of not confusing everybody. I'll just write glue side on there, so I know that's what's going down. I haven't put my face mark on the outside because I don't want to have to clear it off. Some people use chalk rather than a pencil. and then it's all right to put your face side, face edge marks actually onto the veneer. I tend to try and keep those faces free of any sort of marks. So that's ready to glue up. I get my Evo stick, work in a very well ventilated area for obvious reasons. I've got barrier cream on, you can wear gloves too, and I've got a piece of scrap material on my bench, so I'm not getting glue everywhere, and so when I'm using my knife it's not scoring the bench top. So take our spreader and we're going to spread this glue nice and evenly. It's really critical that you get this very, very even all over the veneer. Doesn't matter if you go over the edges too much, because it's not my bench top. And then if you can just get rid of any excess, and I'm going to quickly get that away from that area because I don't want too much glue getting on the bottom. I've got a little bit on there which we'll clean off. Ideally you try and keep the finished side as free of glue as you can. So a little bit more glue on our substrate. Spread it everywhere. A little bit more. That's completely covered. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I need to let that dry until it becomes tacky. And I know it's tacky enough when if I do that it'll stick to my fingers. It's almost there. It's a warm day and the glue's drying quite quickly. It's still a little bit, I can feel it's a little bit wet still. It should be dry to the touch but should still stick to your fingers. What I do is I allow it to reach that tacky stage and then I put another coating of glue on, both the veneer and the substrate. So we've got two lots of glue. We let the second lot of glue go tacky before we start to apply the veneer to the workpiece. Okay, so we've got 2 coats of glue, both of which have gone to the correct tack, and now I'm going to apply them. One thing to bear in mind, if you're veneering something very, very large with impact adhesive, it's really, really critical that you get everything lined up, because once it's touched, once these two faces have touched, they're not going to move anywhere. Whereas with the other method, with the PVA, you've got a little bit of movement, you can move things around, sometimes moves too much, which can be a disadvantage. With this, once it's touched, that's it, you've got no manoeuvring. So I'm just going to demonstrate with a pencil what you'd do for a bigger piece. What you'd say you were doing a tabletop. What you'd need is several dowels, either wooden dowels or acrylic. People use perspex strips, and you put those in place on your workpiece, and you get your alignment done. You might have, imagine this is a tabletop, you'd have several dowels laid out like these, like I've put this pencil and pen, and you'd use them to prevent the veneer coming in contact with the substrate while you line everything up. Especially if you've got something fairly complicated, maybe you've got some book match veneers. Research that, see what book match veneers or quarter match veneers look like. If you've got something like that, it's got to be exactly right. If it's slightly out of square, it's going to look awful, and all your work's down the drain and some expensive veneer. So use your dowels, line everything up, and when you're sure that everything's where you need it, you can roll those dowels out of place, and more carefully than that, bring your veneer into contact with your substrate, and take the dowels progressively out as you roll the veneer into position. So that's something that you do for larger work. For this, it doesn't really matter. All I've got to make sure is that that the grain's nicely lined up, and I've got a little bit of an overlap all the way around, which I've got. Okay, so for the smaller piece, you just do it by eye. Okay, so that's in place. Next thing I do is I get my roller. I've got 2 rollers here. This is a slightly more expensive version, and it's good for larger areas because you can use 2 hands to get a lot of pressure on. You don't really need that for this sort of small work. And what I do now is I take my roller. This probably cost about £10. Got from online tool supplies, Axminster, something like that, and just gently roll my veneer onto my substrate. I'm starting at the middle and working my way out to the edges. So if you imagine arrows over this for my direction of rolling, they're going to start in the middle and work outwards to the corners, to the edges. Watch out when you get to the edges. What you want to avoid is putting too much pressure on and breaking the veneer along its grain as you come to the edges. So you do want to get right up to the edges as you're finishing, and you do want a slight bit of sideways pressure. You just want to make sure that you've got really good contact right up to the edges, but you don't want to break the veneer. Okay, just go over that again. So I'm going from the centre out to the corners, out to the edges, and then just consolidating those edges with my roller. Okay, so that's pretty much ready to work with. A little bit of clean up. We did get a little bit of glue on there. That will sand off with very fine sandpaper. The next thing that we've got to do is trim those edges. Okay, so it would be almost impossible to make your veneer a perfect fit on your substrate, so most people don't bother. We leave a little bit of an overhang, just a few millimetres to trim off afterwards. There are specific tools built for the job. This is a veneer trimmer, which will go around the edge. It'll pick up the edge of your substrate and trim the veneer right back to that edge. It's got a little razor blade in here. Cost you anything from £20 to £30. Just to show that it can be done with simpler and cheaper equipment, I'm just going to use this craft knife, and it's the sort that extends. The blade breaks off, so you can just snap the end of your blade off to get a nice sharp edge. And I'm going to use the fact that that extends right out of the knife to help me. Because if it was like that, I'd be cutting at an angle. If I extend the blade out to here, I can get my blade nicely lined up with the edge of my substrate, and carefully, taking a few goes at this. I'm not trying to cut through everything at once. Just carefully cut through my veneer. That should give me an almost perfect finish along there, which I then finish up either with an extremely sharp and finely set block plane, or again, cheaper and easier route perhaps is some fine sandpaper stuck with double-sided carpet tape to an MDF block. Don't use sandpaper by hand. You'll round the edges off and lose the definition of your piece. We just use this. It's got to be perfectly flat. So holding everything nice and flat and using the edge of my substrate to guide me, I can get an absolutely perfect flush line along there. So that's a couple of methods of gluing your veneer to your substrate. That's how we trim things off afterwards. Just a couple of words to guide you on your own project. Obviously, it's no good having something that looks like a piece of nicely finished timber on the top that looks like MDF on the sides. So what we need to do obviously is we need to put banding around the edges. So carefully chosen veneers fixed to the edges, and we would do those first. You put your edges on under the normal run of things. I haven't done this for demonstration purposes, but when you've got time and you're doing your own project, you'd put your edges on first so that the veneer that sits on top sits slightly overlapping with your edges. So the sequence is going to be, let's say this was a box, imagine it a bit taller. If you're putting a veneer on the bottom veneer goes on first. Then your side veneers go on so they overlap with the bottom veneer and cover that line. There'll be no glue line shown, you'll just see the side veneers, and then finally your top veneer goes on and that slightly overlaps your side veneers. So it's bottom, sides, top, and that's a good rule of thumb as well for any veneering, whether it's a box, a table, the lid of a box or anything like that. Think about how it's all going to look when it's finished, and think about what gives you the least visible glue line. Okay, so hopefully that's got you started with veneering techniques. There's all sorts of things to look into. I mentioned earlier about book matching your veneers. Research that. I'm sure you can find helpful books or videos to show you how to do that. We mentioned also how to deal with trickier grains. We looked at some burr walnut veneer, and I mentioned that we've been using straight grained veneers, and we can fix those straight to the substrate. However, if we're using something with a very, very wild grain, a very strong burr grain, if we just fix that straight to the veneer, it's probably going to bubble up. It's probably going to rise back up off the substrate in time. So another thing for you to look into is how we flatten that veneer ready for use before we glue it down. So there's some personal research for you to do, and some techniques that we're going to try in the workshops in our next practical session.